Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Silva. I'm the NECAN coordinator, and welcome to the 2023 NECAN webinar series. This year, our webinar series will be a little bit different from ones that we've had in the past. We won't be focusing on just one subject or topic throughout. We'll be hearing from many different stakeholders and experts on a wide range of themes over the next few months. The reason for this is that the NECAN Steering Committee will be working on the development of a regional monitoring plan for OA. And these webinars will serve as sort of an informational resource for them as this plan begins to come together. So while the primary audience for these webinars is the NECAN Steering Committee, we also wanted to invite others in our community who would find these webinars to be helpful, interesting, or informative to join us. There will be about 9 or 10 webinars in this series, and the schedule, speaker info, and other details will be updated on our website and through our mailing list. Right now, we have the first 2 webinars listed on the website, but as final details come together for the others, they'll be included there as well. So make sure you're signed up for our newsletter and check the page for this series, which is listed here on the bottom of my slide. Today, we'll be hearing from 3 speakers, Katie Clayton O'Brien, Holly Galavotti, and Ivy Frignoca. At the conclusion of these 3 presentations, the steering committee will ask our panel a few questions, and then we'll open it up for a more general Q&A. You can use the raise hand function on the bottom of your screen if you have a question during that time, or you can submit questions and comments through the chat. Throughout, just please make sure you're muted during the presentations. So first, we'll hear from Katie Clayton O'Brien. She is an environmental analyst with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. She serves as the field coordinator and communication coordinator for the department's Long Island Sound Water Quality Monitoring Program, a position she's held for the past 17 years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Southampton College of Long Island University in Marine Science with a concentration in biology. Katie is also a member of the NECAN Education and Outreach Working Group and assisted in the organization of Shell Day 2019. So I will hand it off to you, Katie.
Thanks very much, Emily.
Welcome.
Are you able to share my screen? Emily, are you able to see my screen?
I can see you, Katie.
I do not see it yet.
Thanks, Nikki.
Oh, perfect.
Oh, sorry. I can see you, Katie. I can't see anything that you're
You
sharing.
can't see the screen?
No, we just see you.
Okay. How about now?
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me today, Emily, Beth, and the NECAN Steering Committee. As Emily mentioned, my name is Katie O'Brien Clayton, and I'm the Field Operations Coordinator for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's Long Island Sound Water Quality Monitoring Program. Today, I'm going to talk about the recent effort of the Long Island Sound Study to expand its base water quality monitoring program to include coastal acidification. The Long Island Sound Study is one of the 28 national estuary programs. It was authorized by Congress in 1985 as a bi-state partnership between EPA, the states of Connecticut and New York, and numerous other state, federal, and non-governmental organizations. The Long Island Sound Study's first comprehensive conservation and management plan was prepared in 1994 and has since undergone 2 revisions, one in 2015 and the second in 2020. The CCMP identifies the specific commitments and recommendations for actions to improve water quality, protect habitat and living resources, educate and involve the public, improve the long-term understanding of how to manage the sound, monitor progress, and redirect management efforts. One of the major water quality issues facing Long Island Sound is persistent summertime hypoxia or low dissolved oxygen concentrations. To address this water quality impairment, in 2000, EPA and the states adopted a pollution budget or total maximum daily load for total nitrogen to reduce nutrient loads entering the sound, meet water quality standards, and improve the GO concentrations. One of the primary missions of Long Island Sound Study is to collect data to document water quality conditions and assess the health of the sound. Between 1988 and 1990, comprehensive field surveys were conducted by researchers at the University of Connecticut, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, and Stony Brook University. In 1991, Connecticut initiated a water quality and hydrographic survey, which, along with New York City DEP survey, still continues to this day. Other partners have joined the monitoring program, including the Interstate Environmental Commission, the University of Connecticut, and most recently in 2019, the Unified Water Study. These two maps show the monitoring station locations of Connecticut Deep, IEC, the Yukon Listed Coast Buoys, and the New York City DEP. The UWS is a volunteer monitoring program which examines the health of the sound's abatements, and their stations are not shown. Our monitoring program has documented a decrease in the area of hypoxia across Long Island Sound. Management efforts have achieved a 58% reduction in the amount of nitrogen entering the sound from point sources like wastewater treatment plants. However, hypoxia still persists annually in the Western Sound, and as shown by Yukon researchers Drs. Mike Whitney and Petty Blahouse in a recent publication, these improvements will not be sustained in a warming climate without continued management efforts. Long Island Sound is home to 4 commercially important shellfish species: oysters, clams, mussels, and scallops. The shellfish industry contributes to the economy of Long Island Sound communities. Focusing on Connecticut, the shellfish aquaculture industry boasts more than $30 million in annual sales and provides over 300 jobs. This isn't counting the impact of recreational shellfish sales. These resources have rightly come into focus for environmental managers, policymakers, and stewards, including the Long Island Sound Study. Connecticut Sea Grant recently published a research brief examining the current and potential implications of temperature extremes, precipitation and salinity, coastal acidification, severe weather and sea level rise on shellfish and seaweed farming in Long Island Sound. In August of 2019, with funding from NECAN and the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, volunteer groups from across New England participated in Shell Day. Shell Day was a bioblitz where all groups collected total alkalinity samples on the same day across the tidal cycle. I coordinated the Connecticut, New York, and Rhode Island sampling. Samples were collected under an EPA-approved quality assurance project plan, and all groups utilized standardized protocols. The Blahouse lab at Yukon analyzed the samples for our area. Following NECAN's Shell Day 2019, a series of papers were published in environmental peer-reviewed journals. The Long Island Sound Study Office heard about the project and other recent research. Managers soon realized that coastal acidification could have a negative impact on the resources and economy of Long Island Sound. Kayla Sullivan, the Long Island Sound Study, was tasked with adding an OA indicator for Long Island Sound. Through the process, we convened a group of OA experts across the region. We examined different sources of available data and identified a data gap and need for more monitoring. As we were examining the sources of data, we developed some critical management questions to ask about acidification impacts, including who is measuring what, how long of a time series is there, where are we monitoring, do we see an impact already? In today's presentation, I'm going to only focus on water quality monitoring data. We found that the main partners have only recently begun monitoring any OA-related parameters. Our Connecticut Deep Monitoring Program began collecting in situ pH data in 2011. The IEC started monitoring for pH in 2014. The Unified Water Study still does not monitor for any OA parameters across the board. However, individual groups within the program do collect pH data. Researchers at Stony Brook University utilized our Connecticut Deep pH data in a publication entitled Coastal Acidification, the Other Eutrophication Problem. Through their analysis and others, we found that we indeed do have a coastal acidification problem in Western Long Island Sound. Jim O'Donnell of the University of Connecticut was able to leverage NERACO's and EPA funds to install continuous pH and PCO2 sensors on 2 listed coast buoys. These sensors revealed extended periods of low aragonite saturation during critical stages of shellfish species life, coincident with increased temperatures and low DO. In 2019, the Blahouse lab along with the Whitney and Baudry labs, began the LIS Respire project. Dr. Vlahos and her graduate students joined us on the research vessel John Dempsey to collect samples, including samples for carbonate chemistry analysis. Subsequent to LIS Respire, Dr. Vlahos was funded for the ELISE project, which examined alkalinity and Long Island Sound abatements. Based on these specific projects, Long Island Sound Study identified the need to develop a long-term monitoring program for coastal acidification. The main monitoring program partners, along with the United States Geological Survey, were charged with adding OA monitoring to their base budget request for federal fiscal year 2022, which began October 1st. The objective of the program is quite broad: to develop a monitoring program to understand long-term coastal acidification trends, drivers, and impacts on Long Island Sound and its abatements. We further defined some desired outcomes of the program, including understanding the interactions with other stressors, particularly hypoxia, HABs, and temperature. This map shows the locations where partners will be sampling acidification parameters. The locations were chosen mostly for ease of implementation. We actually only added one new site. The majority of these locations were where partners were already sampling for other projects, and importantly, also for co-stressors. Alyssa Coast buoys will be maintained at the two prior stations already continuously monitoring for pH and PCO2. The 10 Connecticut deep stations were chosen based on the Respire project, as well as for being along both the east-west and north-south axes of the Sound, and are a subset of our 17 year-round nutrient monitoring stations. The IEC stations were chosen from their open water nutrient sites, also part of their long-term monitoring program. The USGS Connecticut abatement stations were identified as Connecticut priorities through an EPA Integrated Water Resources Management exercise by our TMDL group, as well as in the major rivers. The USGS portion and stations will look at changes related to primary productivity and respiration in these estuaries, as well as the effects of large freshwater flows throughout the year. The USGS New York stations are at Flax Pond, a decommissioned continuous water quality site that is being reestablished, as well as in Oyster Bay. The Oyster Bay site is the lone new site for the OA monitoring program that was established this year and will allow for synergies with other current research efforts in the area. Once we know where we were going to monitor, we had to decide what we were going to monitor for. To constrain the carbon cycle and calculate saturation state, we need to measure a minimum of 2 out of 4 parameters: pH, total alkalinity, dissolved inorganic carbon, or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. We also need to know the temperature and salinity of the sample. The work group chose DIC, TA, and pH. The reasons for this are various, but as noted by Patsivas et al. In 2015, DIC and TA samples can be conveniently preserved using mercuric chloride, thus halting photosynthesis and respiration, and then stored for later analysis. Others may choose pH and DIC because pH measurements are rapid and precise, and the DIC measurements are free of matrix effects, such as the influence of organics. Additionally, Dr. Vlahos pointed out that PCO2 measurements are costly and fluctuate on a very short time scale, which is compounded in the summer due to biological activity. pH does change rapidly, but we will be able to gauge the shifts by also taking in situ ship-based measurements. Our OA partners are currently at various stages of preparing, reviewing, and finalizing quality assurance project plans, and monitoring will begin once their CLAPs have been approved by EPA. At this point, Long Island Sound Study will be convening a work group meeting in April to provide project updates and talk about data management and communications. We're also going to discuss steps for 2024. We've encountered some hiccups along the way associated with differences in methods and new equipment availability. We're seeking funding for an intercalibration study for all labs performing analysis of Long Island Sound samples. We could further enhance our program by incorporating more nearshore areas with documented shellfish populations or aquaculture operations and adding HAB monitoring. I personally love the idea of a regional monitoring plan. I think it will help avoid duplication of efforts and could lead to additional funding sources. Additionally, I would love to see this plan result in a proactive stance for managers versus the need for reactive actions. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions at the end.
Thank you, Katie. So up next, we'll hear from Holly Galavotti. Holly has worked at the Environmental Protection Agency for 18 years. She works in the Oceans, Wetlands, and Communities Division in the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds. She's currently the co-lead of the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act rulemaking. She's also the lead for ocean and coastal acidification issues and enjoys working closely with the National Estuary Programs, EPA's Office of Research and Development, and other federal agencies and stakeholders on this topic. Holly has a master's degree in environmental sciences from University of Virginia and a bachelor's degree in biology from James Madison University. Take it away, Holly.
Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Today, I would like to share some additional information about the long-term coastal acidification monitoring that is conducted by EPA's National Estuary Programs. Some additional information that Katie was talking about. EPA partnered with the NEPs to build a monitoring network to better understand the vulnerability of estuaries to coastal acidification. And EPA recently put together 3 reports on this monitoring that I'd like to share with you today that can inform your regional monitoring plan. Okay, I'm trying to advance my slide. Are you seeing my slides moving?
They're not advancing. You said you had a second screen. Maybe it's still on that.
No, I took that off. Oops, I just saw something. Okay,
yep, there you go.
Thanks. Okay, so I just wanted, a quick overview of the program. As Katie mentioned, the National Estuary Program, it's a non-regulatory program. There are 28 significant estuaries across the United States that are defined on a watershed scale. Their priorities are defined locally by local government, city, state, federal, private, and nonprofit stakeholders. And then EPA headquarters and regions work with the NEPs to provide funding, oversight, and management. In 2015 and 2016, EPA funded several NEPs to purchase these continuous in situ monitoring sensors for PCO2 and pH to characterize the carbonate conditions in the estuaries. And while these sensors have been used extensively in the open ocean, these NEPs and others are expanding their use in the coastal environment, where there are different challenges than in the open ocean, such as biofouling and high variability. These NEPs vary in geographic region, size, coastal dynamic and processes, and stressors and local economies. So this diversity presented us a good opportunity to evaluate coastal acidification priorities and processes across a variety of environmental conditions. Partnerships have been really critical in accomplishing this monitoring. Many of the NEPs are working with local universities and colleges and federal agencies, all to accomplish this monitoring and the data analysis. And I know this audience is very familiar with the importance of the vulnerability of estuaries to the impacts of acidification. So we think that these sensors were really important to establish baselines and to evaluate trends. The first report that I want to talk about was titled Measuring Coastal Acidification Using In Situ Sensors in the National Estuary Program. And this, the goal of this report was really to provide detailed information about each of the NEP's goals, their deployments, the preliminary results, how they manage the data, and lessons learned, so that we could share this with other NEPs that want to conduct this monitoring, and also other agencies that are doing this monitoring in estuaries. We also wanted to use the NEPs as a good example of using this data in management documents, in their comprehensive conservation and management plans, their CCMPs, and the State of the Bay reports. So this report provides details about how these NEPs are using different deployment methods. They're using moorings, such as Tampa Bay has their equipment on a NOAA station. Several NEPs have their equipment at different depths, such as in San Francisco, they have their equipment at a shallow depth at 1 meter, and then also at 60 meters. Barnegat Bay, Casco Bay, and Tillamook are all using docks. And coastal Bend Bays and Mass Bays are using coolers to, with their sensors in the cooler, to pump the surface water into the cooler with the sensors to avoid some of the biofouling issues that we're seeing in these estuaries with these sensors. What is great about working with the NEPs is that they have a really broad view of understanding the vulnerability and then how to translate that into adaptive strategies. And so we're really learning a lot from this monitoring, how to deal with some of the challenges in working with coastal settings, using this data to evaluate baselines, characterizing the vulnerability at high temporal resolution, improving our understanding of land-based and oceanic influence and drivers, the impacts on shellfish and other organisms by calculating aragonite saturation, and the effectiveness of adaptive strategies. For example, in Santa Monica and Tampa Bay, they're looking at using seagrass and kelps. The second, so that first report really provided a lot of details of the deployments. For the second report, we took a look at the initial data that was collected by 7 of the NEPs. So 2 in the Northeast, 2 in the Gulf Coast, and 3 on the West Coast. This paper was led by my colleague, Nick Rosenau, and some of you on the phone were some of the co-authors. And this title of this report was Integrating High Resolution Coastal Acidification Monitoring Data Across 7 NEPs. And it was really to take a look at the data, evaluate what we could learn about the baseline carbonate chemistry, look at the potential drivers within each estuaries, but also take a look at how we could compare the data regionally and across the NEPs. So of those 7 sites, there were various lengths of data records as these NEPs were just initially deploying their equipment. Casco Bay had the longest monitoring data set, really we will eventually need multi-year and even decade deployments to start capturing this natural vulnerability and understand the baseline, tease out drivers, and look at trends. But this is a really good start. Some of the NEPs have telemetry. Some of them go out and download the data. They're all collecting discrete samples for calibration. And then some of the NEPs had enough data to calculate aragonite saturation. So here is a look at, these are bot plots, including all of the underlying data, showing the distribution of PCO2 across the 7 NEPs. And these are arranged from the lowest PCO2 in Mission Aransas estuary, this is in the Gulf in Texas, to the highest medium PCO2 in Barnegat Bay. And you can really see that certain of the NEPs have a large variability in the range of PCO2, and some of them have more of a narrow range. But we definitely saw that in estuaries, there was a higher variability and higher range of PCO2 than what we see in the open ocean. And here's the pH data with the NEPs arranged in the same order. And as expected, the PCO2 and the pH data generally mirror each other. And again, we see a larger range of pH in the estuaries. Some of that variability in PCO2 and pH can be explained seasonally. Monitoring across all the water bodies showed that temperature and PCO2 co-varied, suggesting that PCO2 variability was governed in part by seasonal temperature changes, with on average PCO2 being lower and less variable in cooler winter months and higher and more low variable in warmer and summer months. And this trend was especially clear in the Casco Bay data, which shows the seasonality of this higher PCO2, this orange line, along with higher temperatures in black and lower DO in the summer. And in our report, you'll see that these variables are described as thermal and non-thermal controls. We didn't have really enough data on each NEP to make definitive statements about the drivers, but we use the data that we have to evaluate what we could say about thermal and non-thermal controls. And in Casco Bay and in others, we really saw some signals of these non-thermal controls, which we attribute to high rates of microbial respiration driven by nutrient loadings and water column stratification during the summer. So, over time, additional data would be needed to make more definitive statements about the drivers. So we saw these seasonal patterns in other NEPs. This is an example of Santa Monica Bay, where the highest PCO2 values were observed earlier in the year in the spring. And this time series plot for Santa Monica, we think we see a clear coastal upwelling signal, where you see the high PCO2 during times of low temperature, low DO, and high salinity. This coastal upwelling signal was also observed in San Francisco and Tillamook. Santa Monica was a unique estuary compared to the other sites in that it was more of an open ocean or open coastal site and deeper. So those are just some examples of how we are looking at comparing the data across the NEPs. And as I mentioned, more data will be needed to more understand the baseline and identifying the drivers. But the data that we had was sufficient to really look at these seasonal timescales. And we really did find that the sensors are successfully capturing these key parameter measurements in order to capture these daily and seasonal trends. One important goal of the NEP coastal acidification monitoring programs is to really inform these management decisions, and calculating aragonite saturation will be an important part of that. The NEPs are that we looked at are making real good progress in capturing the parameters necessary to calculate aragonite saturation. Unfortunately for this paper, we didn't have enough data to calculate aragonite saturation for each of the NEPs to compare. But we look forward to continuing this monitoring in order to better evaluate the drivers, understand the vulnerability, and to get more information on mitigation and adaptation strategies. So as you can see, these NEPs and their partners generated a large volume of high quality, high temporal resolution carbonate chemistry data. However, data storage and accessibility of that data was also often limited. It was on local computers and local networks. And we also found that when we gathered the data, it was often in different formats and units, and it took a bit of work to get all that data sorted in order for data comparison. So looking at that need, we collaborated with NERACUS and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute to conduct an evaluation to provide NEPs, their partners. And then we also looked at the Shell Day data. And we looked at how we could use publicly accessible online data repositories for submitting this time series coastal acidification data. So that it would be formatted consistently and publicly available. I'll mention that our first stop was to EPA's Exchange Network group, but unfortunately at this time, EPA system does not accept this type of time series data. So we really wanted to look more broadly. So the way that we conducted this evaluation was that we interviewed NEP data providers and the coastal acidification community data users to better understand their data management needs. And then the findings of these interviews were synthesized into attributes that we could use to evaluate the data repositories. Then we conducted test cases. Once the repositories were identified, then we conducted test cases to use the repositories and get feedback on that experience. There were 5 federally supported repositories that we looked at that used excuse me, fair data principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We really found that there was 2 of them that were the most suitable for this coastal acidification time series data, and that was Quasi HydroShare and NOAA's NCEI OCAD system. And we found that these 2 data repositories were most suitable because they were the most user-friendly and employed a robust approach to metadata to make the data sets discoverable, accessible, and interoperable. We also looked at Quasi's hydrologic information systems database, as I mentioned, EPA's Exchange Network, and NOAA's IUS partnership. So this report also provides general best practices for using a data repository, using the discovery tools, preparing your metadata, and understanding processes for submitting the data and accessing an already published data set. So I hope that these 3 reports will be helpful for your group, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Holly. So finally, we're going to hear from Ivy Frignoca. As Casco Baykeeper, Ivy is the chief advocate for Casco Bay. In speaking passionately on behalf of the Bay, she's able to draw on her experiences, including as an environmental educator, an advocate for Vermont's public lands in Lake Champlain, and most recently, as a senior attorney with Conservation Law Foundation. Her previous work on oceans, clear water, and clean air issues throughout New England provides her with an in-depth knowledge of the issues she continues to confront, including ocean acidification, excess nitrogen, and reducing wastewater discharges and storm water runoff. Go ahead, Ivy.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm here to talk with you about a collaborative effort we're doing in Maine. And I'm Ivy Frignoca, I'm the Casco Baykeeper with Friends of Casco Bay. And one of the issues that we've been really working on from the start of Maine's efforts are to better understand ocean acidification along our coast. And we started in about 2014, 2015, when Maine was the second state in the nation to pass a law requiring an ocean acidification study commission to be formed. Oregon was the first state. They had a lot more funding. They were able to get a permanent blue ribbon commission started. And unlike Oregon, Maine does not have those resources. And so we did what Mainers always do. We rolled up our sleeves, and a group of people, both government and private sector and researchers and legislators and just people who are very passionate and love the ocean and were interested in learning more about ocean acidification, got together and began to work collaboratively and shared what little resources we had to begin ocean acidification monitoring. And that network of people has gone through a couple different iterations. And its current formation right now is called Maine Ocean Climate Collaborative. This is just a voluntary network. And this effort was born of a truck ride that Friends of Casco Bay, our staff scientist is Mike Doan, who may be on this call by now or may not, but he's been monitoring ocean acidification. Will be his 8th year. Mike and I were out in our truck going to some of our seasonal monitoring sites, and he was talking about conversations he had with scientists at Wells Reserve, with Chris Hunt at UNH, with Jess Waller at the Department of Marine Resources, with Angie Brewer, who wanted to do monitoring for the Department of Environmental Protection. We were so excited about the work that Down East Institute was starting to do. And so we were just talking about all these different conversations, and we said, this is crazy. We need to get everyone in the same room and talking at the same time so we can continue to learn from one another. And that's how this current iteration came together. And we've been meeting for a couple of years. So because I'm here to speak on behalf of that network, I'm just going to quickly share where the monitoring is occurring and what we're doing. And unlike the last two presentations, I think really focus on what we are working on as a group, which is different than the last two presentations, because what we've really identified are problems with what we're doing, that we've been doing this monitoring long enough to have really gotten into what are the issues with the equipment that we're using that we need to resolve, and how do we get to that next level of quality assurance that is needed when we don't have millions of dollars in our budget for this type of monitoring, to ensure that our data is good enough for management decisions and regulatory decisions to be made in reliance on it. So you can see in the legend the groups I'm going to talk about. The groups that are also part of our network that aren't represented with stars today isn't because they're not stars. It's just these are the active monitoring right now. So Bigelow and Island Institute are also a critical part of this network and contribute to it. And they have done OA monitoring in Casco Bay. And Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, which Holly mentioned, is also a critical part of this network. And I believe the data that Holly was referring to is data that in part was collected by doctors Joe Salisbury and Chris Hunt from UNH during the couple of years that they had a continuous monitoring station in Casco Bay. And then the Estuary Partnership helps fund our research and continuous monitoring in Casco Bay. So without further ado, let me introduce you to some of the players. So we're very excited to have this coastwide network, and starting with this red star up here, the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries got a grant to work with the Passamaquoddy Nation to do water quality monitoring in the Scudic River or St. Croix, depending on which name for the same river you use. And the goal of that monitoring is to help with river restoration. And they are starting with monitoring freshwater and hope to add more of the ocean acidification parameters in the future. They joined our network, and like many of the rest of us, to have a consistent database, they are using YSI SONs. Like many of the rest of us, they have run into problems with those YSI SONs this summer. It's been very difficult with supply chain issues to get sensors and to get SONs serviced. So they have finally gotten their temperature and conductivity probes to put in their sensors, and they'll be deploying as soon as the ice is out. So coming down to the Black Star Down East Institute, and I think I saw that Rob Holmberg is on this call. Down East Institute, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Dr. Brian Beal, who runs DEI, finally fulfilled his dream of building this beautiful new research facility. And it's really amazing. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend a site visit to it if you're in beautiful Down East Maine. And as part of that, an OA lab, very sophisticated lab, was built there, and Dr. Rob Holmberg was hired. And what's so exciting about what Rob and the lab are adding to our knowledge is that most of us are focused on understanding the carbonate chemistry of the nearshore water. And Rob is really focusing, he's adding the sediment pH studies and experimenting with ways to do continuous monitoring of that. And it's pretty sophisticated. He's about to go into his 3rd year of that type of monitoring. And I can quickly explain it to you. He collects mud, he puts it in a centrifuge to separate the pore water from the sediment, and then he analyzes the pore water. I'm sure he can tell you all the details of it, but it's really exciting. We're glad it's part of this network. And he just received a grant from the Broadreach Foundation. So he's just hired a lab manager so he can go out and do a 3rd year of experiments, and he's working on designing 2 other OA related experiments. So moving down to the mid-coast region, you can see that there's a lot of research clustered there. And I was kind of really glad we put this map together for today, because it really helps show the data gaps or where more monitoring is occurring or slated to occur. So in this mid-coast region, there are 3 sets of monitoring. The Department of Marine Resources, the sort of darker, I guess you'd call that magenta star out here, has a station in Booth Bay that has been collecting data since 1905. And in the last 3 to 4 years, they have also tried to emulate our model. And I'll spend a little bit more time on the forensic Casco Bay model, where they're deploying instruments to collect ocean acidification data and analyzing it. They're slightly different than ours. We use a Turner pre-CO2 sensor. They've been using a CFET sensor, but they have been adding the OA data. And this summer, we're going to start doing, or last summer, to build out some public education around that. Also in that area, you can see the 3 green stars. Those are sites that aren't deployed yet, but the Department of Environmental Protection plans to do continuous monitoring in 3 estuaries a year. They've selected 3 sites in this mid-coast region. They will use sondes, either YSI or a similar sonde at those 3 sites. And they are hoping to have funding this summer to collect water samples to be analyzed for total alkalinity and pH. And if not this summer, then they hope to have that funding for next summer. And then the 3rd star in the area is the Bowdoin Center, and their data, it's a pretty sophisticated lab setup. It is mostly used for education at the college, but the raw data is available upon request. And they also are doing some really incredible research on paleo analysis of carbonate chemistry. So let me just, so they're using paleo proxies to assess pH in the Gulf of Maine so that they can try to sort of understand a benchmark of how pH has changed over time, and being able to look at the trends in the data. So that has added a really interesting layer to our research. Friends of Casco Bay, this is the yellow star. I'll come back to us in a moment. And the final site in Maine is at the Wells Reserve. And the scientists there are also trying to use a model similar to what we're doing at Friends of Casco Bay so that we can have comparable data and easy to deploy and maintain ways to collect data. And the difference with their sites from our sites is that they're more, our sites, Casco Bay maintains a pretty high salinity level, and some of their sites are sort of more truly estuarine or more brackish waters. So it's been really interesting and fun to compare data with them. And then I would be remiss to not conclude our data with the UNH site, even though it's in New Hampshire. The lab that Chris Hunt maintains has been critical for many of us as we run down and use his brains in his lab to help us make sure our instruments are working properly and to help with analysis of water samples for total alkalinity and pH. So that's an overview of the network. Hold on a second. And then I can show you a little bit zooming in about the how we're collecting data and how that data is available. So this is zooming in on Friends of Casco Bay. And if I can get rid of that stop share. I don't know if you can see this. I have an annoying share screen message across the bottom that I don't seem to be able to get rid of.
We can't see that, Ivy.
Oh, okay. So the 3 yellow stars are where our 3 continuous monitoring stations are. The one in the middle of Casco Bay in Yarmouth, we're going into our 8th year of monitoring there. And I think that's the long-term data set that Curtis Bolin at the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership uses the most. And to show you how simple our station is, why it works, because it's not super expensive. This is Mike and I out at that Yarmouth station. And this is what our station includes: a YSI sonde, a Turner PCO2, C-Sense sensor, and a logger. And we deploy that, and then every 2 to 3 weeks, Mike takes this cage out, puts a new one in with the same data in, and downloads the data and analyzes it. And so we have 3 sites, which means we have 6 sets of equipment so that we can constantly change things out, keep the equipment well calibrated, and keep our database, up to date and as current as possible. And this system worked very well until recently, which I'll talk about in a moment. But then to show you how this data is then used, you can see I just went into the Yarmouth station. That here is here's all the categories of data, and I will just pick one to show you. If you click on it, you can go in and you can see the range, the data range over the years that we've been collecting data, the sort of median, and then this is this year's data in comparison to what's happening in the past. So so our data is pretty easy to look at. The underlying data is always available to researchers, but we try to make this available to anyone from the public with sort of a nice, easy explanation of why a particular parameter is important and why we're monitoring for it. So the, whoops, hold on a second. I didn't need to go all the way out there. You go back in. That's not. Give me a moment. So what we have run into is we have this sort of simple, affordable system that is within the range for departments like DEP and DMR in Maine to afford to do monitoring, for small nonprofits like us to afford to do monitoring, for Wells Reserve to replicate. And then the pandemic hit. And then also we're at the point in monitoring where some of these new pieces of equipment, there have been enough problems with them over this nascent period of monitoring that manufacturers are discontinuing certain products. So the CFET sensor that some of our colleagues are relying upon. Seabird is no longer servicing them. The Turner PCO2 sensor that we're using, the logger for it is discontinued. And then we had so many problems with the YSI SONs getting sensors and getting things serviced. And we were also finding with the PCO2 sensor that it would come back and we weren't sure it was even calibrated right. And we were very concerned about the readings that we were getting. And so this network met in November and we discussed all of the equipment problems everyone was having. And we decided to collaborate and create an Excel spreadsheet, which you're seeing in the background here, that lists what equipment everyone is using and how it's working, what issues and concerns you're having with it, and who's using the equipment. And then we're using this sheet to design some studies this summer to pilot new equipment to see if there's a way that we can take what we've all learned, what isn't working, and work together this summer to come up with a suite of instruments that are needed to measure OA that work for everyone, whether you're a big institute and can get in research funds, or you're friends of Casco Bay who's going to be here for the long term, but needs to do our monitoring in a scrappier budget. And so that effort is also being funded by Broad Reach, and it involves Friends of Casco Bay, the Wells Reserve, and UNH. And there's a team, I think they're calling themselves
Ivy, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Are you showing a spreadsheet right now or that map?
I was
still?
showing the spreadsheet.
Oh, okay, we were just seeing the map still. Could you share your screen again with that?
Yes. Can you see it now?
There you go. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Okay, I'm so sorry. So this is the spreadsheet I was referring to. And I can, I have to ask the group, but I could share this if it's of any interest, but you can see that it lists the equipment that is being used, and what problems, issues, or concerns people are having with it. And then on the last column is who's using the equipment. And then this is what we're using to design experiments this summer. So Chris, Hunt, Mike Doan, and Jeremy and Jason from Wells Reserve are all working together to pick a suite of instruments that they'll test in various coastal locations with differing degrees of salinity, and still collecting TA and pH samples and working with Chris Hunt on the analysis. So I think what we've learned is that there are more problems that we need to solve before we can have data that we feel is at a level that can be used for resource management decisions. And it's a very exciting place to be because it's still a fledgling area of research. And it's such a collaborative effort. But we're not quite there to answer all of the questions that we were asked to answer. We're asking the same questions that that Beth asked us about for this presentation. So that's just a quick overview. Happy to answer any questions and also to defer to my wonderful colleagues who are on this call and part of this network.
Thank you, Ivy. And thank you, Katie and Holly as well. I'm going to turn this over to members of the NECAN Steering Committee to pose some questions to our panel.
Hi, this is Beth Turner. I'll start off. So I think everybody today mentioned they wanted to be able to use this data to inform management decisions. And what are those management decisions that you hope to inform? Are they primarily nutrient management type decisions?
Again, I'm speaking for a network. So I know for Angie Brewer at the Department of Environmental Protection, and Wendy's on the phone, but I know that ultimately, let me just make sure I'm getting her language right. She was looking at using this data to identify impairments, and then also to understand whether this needs to be incorporated into water quality standards. And I think the other management decisions, I think the data that Rob is collecting is really extremely helpful in terms of like, what are we doing for wild shellfish management in the near shore? So it's a whole range of issues. For us as a nonprofit, I'll be using it as an advocate for all of those purposes.
Thanks, Ivy. Katie, are those similar in Connecticut?
Yes, I would say they are definitely similar. As I mentioned in my presentation, the main issue in Long Island Sound is hypoxia. So it relates to our nutrient management programs. However, we also have the great shellfish resources, and Long Island Sound Study is putting a lot of money and effort into habitat restoration. One of our CCMP goals is restoring the shellfish population, as well as eelgrass beds, and knowing the implications of OCA coastal acidification are very important for those aspects as well.
Thanks. And then I have one more question. Katie, it was nice to see your last slide talking about the benefits of having a wider monitoring plan. I'm trying to think about how a monitoring plan would augment what you're doing. How do you think it would benefit what you're already doing? This isn't just for you, Katie, this is for all of you. Thinking about how can we create a plan that works to best help you out, I guess, is my question.
As we've gone through the process of picking stations, picking parameters, we've looked at a lot of different literature, a lot of different programs across the country. And I think that if NECAN could help in putting everything in one place, it would be a lot easier for programs to start up a new sampling process, a new sampling program. Just including information on how to pick stations, different methods that we should use. One of the main things that we've encountered, the Vlahouse lab does one method, USGS does another, and then Evelyn's not on the call, but I'm going to call out a commercial lab where they actually froze the gas samples, instructed them to freeze the gas samples before analysis. So just having all of this information in one spot would be very helpful for groups, I think.
Yeah, I think we're finding it hard to, we're talking about are there standards that we could adopt and agree to, but it's hard because everybody has sort of different budgets and different access to equipment and different things that they can build upon. So I think like the commonalities are we're all trying to do monitoring, most of us. There are people doing other work like what Rob is doing, but most of us are trying to do like deployments in the near shore where we don't have to go out to buoys and maintain it. But the biggest thing that we've talked about from a NOAA perspective is it would be so great to have technical assistance. Like, I don't know if we could regionally have like a big network, because I'm not even sure we can have that yet in for our state, because our state coast is so big. But to get the technical assistance as we're say working on something right now, like CFET's not working, the PCO2 sensor's not working, here's our 3 other choices, and here's what's good and here's what's bad. And so having some expert support and funding to experiment, or a loaning program of equipment that we could experiment with and see how it works for us, I think would be really, really helpful. And whether that comes through the Wells Reserve or whatever that ties into our network, that's what I can think of for right now, for based on where our network is at.
There does seem to be a lot of interest in your spreadsheet of problems. And so maybe we will be following up with you on that and seeing if we can get input from other groups around the region on that as well.
Yeah, I was
I'll just
thinking I
add
could
that we
ask.
found it very, we found it very helpful to get all of the NEPs together. Those were the most valuable conversations that we had of how to deal with the equipment, how to deal with biofouling, how you can co-monitor with other parameters. So I do think that's very valuable.
And Holly, to follow up on that, did you all, is that in some of the reports? You know what I mean? Kind of like the summaries of those conversations and the recommendations?
Yes, the first report was our best compilation of lessons learned across the different NEPs. And it would be great if we could continue to update that report as things move and change, because, you know, the equipment problems, we weren't, you know, the supply chain and equipment problems were new. So it would be great to update that. But yeah, there's a lot of details there on lessons learned.
Dwight, I know you've had your hand up for a bit. Did you want to ask your question?
Sure. First, I want to say, thanks to the three of you. This has been very informative to me, independent of our primary objectives that we have right here for this webinar series. I'm amazed to see that these data sets are actually being acquired out there, and really eager to see how we can coordinate them better. But I think what struck me with what the three of you presented is that as we think about monitoring priorities, I'm seeing that a lot of the priorities that you're speaking to are ancillary are ancillary to the actual physical observing asset, and X marks the spot. They're related to stuff like intercomparison studies, technical support, laboratories that are running, validation analysis. What's the throughput capability of those labs? And if we expand observing, are they capable of handling that throughput? Is there resources to provide for that? The robust, maintaining, it's great to have a commercially available sensor, but as we've seen with Seabird and others, ensuring that industry is being a good partner and supporting the community is critical. And I think all of this needs to be spoken to within these priorities in this plan. And they're not things that I would have brought up, especially. So do you agree with that sentiment that there are issues beyond simply X marks the spot and this is what we need to observe, that are really related to, all right, we are already measuring X marks the spot with what we want, but we don't have all this ancillary stuff to make sure that it's maintained and coordinated. Is that true?
I can just start. I think that what I found with working with the NEPs, it's really a desire to get this working well in this spot before we expand. So I think that's why we're hearing a lot of let's get this working right now, right here.
And the NEPs are distributed, around the nation. Just the coverage that you have. I'm wondering, is there a more formal integration we can have with our coastal OA networks around the United States to ensure that we're making sure that everyone that's engaged at the NEPs, it's because that's our primary mode of communication with our program, is to make sure that there's some touch point with the cans. And if our cans aren't properly folding in all of those NEP sites, then I feel that we're missing a lot of observing capabilities.
No, I think in looking at the answer to your question, I think there's some of both. Like, so an organization like mine, right? We're not a regulatory agency. So our monitoring has been to track and identify change over time. And so as we began to look at, oh my gosh, if we have if at entering our 8th year, we have one of the longer term data sets now of continuous OA monitoring, is that data robust enough? And then, then the questions get asked on the technical side that when you're saying the X marks the spot, when you're collecting your pH data with a YSI sonde, even if you're calibrating it and switching it out every 2 weeks, is that pH data accurate enough? Because if it's off by just a little bit, by the time you calculate your other parameters out from that, what errors are you making? And so when this network originally came together, we were really comparing equipment, like deploying a CFET next to our YSI sonde and measuring them, or bringing the equipment down to Chris Hunt's lab and seeing how it worked under his laboratory conditions. So I'm not even sure it was at, okay, X marks the spot, we have the sweet spot right now, because everybody's working within their budget. And then as we started meeting about that, it suddenly became, okay, wait, the people who can afford CFET, it's not working right now because they can't get it serviced. Those of us who are using the YSI sondes and doing our very, very best to ensure that it's high quality pH data are also having trouble. So it became this opportunity where there were sort of both issues coming together. And on the technical aspects of that, I think Chris Hunt and Mike Doan could really give you the details, but that's like at a high overview that I think there's still work for us at our level on both ends.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. And just one more question, really to Katie, related to Long Island Sound. So who's the primary recipients of the mapping that you're doing? You're mapping out sort of the total volume of hypoxia in Long Island Sound. Who's reading those maps, and what decisions are being made based on those maps?
So Connecticut Deep produces the maps, and they are sent to a stakeholder list of over 200 people, including EPA Long Island Sound Study, EPA Region 1, and the universities. Based on the maps, we look at our different management actions. We've met the TMDL for point sources. Now we're going after our non-point sources. We're moving into our embayments and looking at hypoxia within the embayments. And so the primary users of the maps, I would say, are the states as well as EPA, Long Island Sound Study Office.
Right. So it's actually being used as a metric to track if the reductions in the TMLs are actually having the desired outcome, right?
Yes. Yep.
So would there be interest in an ancillary maps related to, say, saturation state or some pH aspect to it? Would that add a higher fidelity of information by which they could see the effects of changing nutrients on the system? Would that be of interest to them?
It would be of interest to me. I think Mark Tedesco is on the call, and I can let him speak, or Mel, in terms of Long Island Sound Study. But in Connecticut, for our program, yes, I think it would definitely be important for us.
Yeah, hi Dwight. Great to see you again, and Beth too, a couple of the founders of NECAN. Yeah, I serve on the Long Island Sound Study Management Committee for Region 1, and Katie hit it right on the head there. It's helping us track current TMDL implementation. It may well inform future updates of the TMDL or other management actions implemented through other means. And as far as the additional desaturation data, I think we would absolutely be interested in that. We have a lot more resources than we did even 5 years ago, and are able to take on new challenges, more priorities than previously. And so a lot of interest in this. We've got a really active science and technical advisory committee that I think also would be really interested in pursuing something like that. So
thank you. That's great.
I have a question for the group, and it's that, so one of the things that I kept hearing folks talk about was So first, I realized none of the NECAN Steering Committee introduced ourselves, but you just said people were, and people know Dwight. I'm Samantha Sadlecki. I'm an assistant professor at UConn, and I work on regional simulations, but I'm also a co-chair of NECAN. And there are some other folks that don't have their cameras on, but I see Chris Hunt. He's also on the steering committee, and Kamiko. Anyways, there's other folks that are on the call here that are on here that are also on the steering committee as well. But I just was just wondering about the, you know, if you had if your networks would be interested. I heard the struggle of, you know, the carbon measurements being intense and requiring expert, expert evaluations or technical advice beyond sometimes the capacity that exists within the region to support currently. And that's a real need, and I appreciate that. I guess I was wondering if some of the other, if you have existing capacity to support, like, you know, some of the oxygen measurements maybe further back, or nutrient measurements, or any of these other things, if the communities have thought about kind of using those along with some other basic hydrographic fields, you know what I mean, to, you know, use those relationships like have been developed elsewhere, and in some cases, you know, more broadly on the shelf, you know, to kind of extend those records back in time. And if that approach would be more like, you know, like, I don't know, if that would be more appealing given the, you know, like if there's more comfort with like some of these other sensor types, like temperature, salinity, oxygen, nutrients, and you know, kind of if those conversations have happened kind of within your various communities, like what the response had been. It's kind of complicated, but I don't know if it made sense. Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask a clarifying question. Are you asking if we would consider using, you know, the temperature and salinity as proxies for the OA parameters? Well, based
Alongside
on
maybe
our
some
shell,
others like oxygen, nitrogen, or, you know, if whatever other hydrographic data that you may have longer records of. Yeah.
it would be interesting, but I thought as the outcome of Shell Day, we weren't quite there yet on East Coast to do that. So I guess that would be for you and Dwight and Adam and Chris to say whether or not we could do that.
Yeah, I think with these programs you have in place now that are collecting and characterizing the carbonate system more rigorously, there may be cases where we can start deriving proxy relationships. In fact, that's even what we're doing from our own program right now, is we're starting to look a lot more at using oxygen, for example, and using it as a proxy measure. Once we have very highly constrained algorithms worked out using very carefully obtained carbonate chemistry data, then it allows us to kind of use simpler sensors with routine validation checks with carbonate chemistry, and allows us to tap into other data sets, both spatially and temporally. So it might be more affordable for you to have a whole host of oxygen and nutrient sensors out there and have a couple of small subsets where it's really doing carbonate chemistry that are allowing you to inform and update the algorithms that allow you to then expand it into other data sets.
Yeah, I'll mention one other program that EPA is working on is our National Coastal Condition Assessment, and that is a much broader range. It's about 800 coastal sites where we are looking, in 2020, 2021, we measured total alkalinity and salinity. And we're trying to repeat that in 2025 and make it a regular part of the National Coastal Condition Assessment. And hopefully that'll give us some more information using, you know, not the PCO2 difficult sensors, but what we can learn from total alkalinity. And Jason Greer and Cheryl Brown are working on understanding the TA and salinity relationships, so then we can look at other places.
And unless Chris has something different to say, I would say invite us back and ask the question in 2 years after we have a 2-year study cycle. And I think Chris, I invite you to chime in here, but I think a lot of what you all will be exploring is not just the sensors, but what are the best ways to collect the data and calculate the data and have the best data set possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We have a number of sort of ambitious goals for this 2-year project that I'm working on with Mike and friends of Casco Bay. And Sam, I like your idea of looking at proxies. I think that, you know, under careful consideration of conditions, they can be really useful. I've started doing that with some of our like high temporal resolution data in our coastal lab, and sometimes it's really helpful. Other times it makes me a little bit worried. So I think there's a lot of thought that goes into that. This is a little bit of a misdirect, but I was really glad that Holly brought up the topic of what to do with your data once you collect it, because this is a topic that maybe doesn't come up enough sometimes, I think. And I think Holly, I really appreciate you mentioning that. And I know Ivy, your group you do your own hosting and your own data serving on your own website. I don't know if your data gets passed on to any other organizations or if you keep it pretty much in-house. I was curious about Katie and what your programs do with the data, and then just thoughts about how you might picture a regional observing system trying to tackle data integration, or even if a regional observing system should try that or leave it up to the individual groups who make up that system.
It sounds like you asked 2 questions. The first is our data. The simple question is all of our data is collected with QUAPs. And so DEP has our data, and the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership uses our data. And it was definitely a big part of Curtis's State of the Bay. And I suspect that information that he provided to Holly, that in addition to the monitoring you and Joe did in Casco Bay, that was a lot based on our data set. So your second question about regional plans, I mean, what's really needed is data in the very near shore where you know OA makes a difference to shellfish and aquaculture is, and so I'm not sure. You know, it's so localized. When I think about even just conversations within our network with someone such as Angie Brewer, it's almost just thinking that it almost needs to break down by region. And I've heard Rob Holmberg raise questions like, are the conditions that he's monitoring down east, I mean, and the shellfish that he's seeing there, they're under completely different conditions than in southern Maine. So I don't know if we know the answer to your question. Like it's been hard enough to try to standardize what we're doing along the Maine coast. And I'm looking at it at a higher level. I'm not the technical scientist like all of you are. So I don't know what the benefit is. I think some of the ideas people were dancing around, like what are the possibilities? What are networks? What are people using? What are the problems they're having? How can we work toward getting a suite of instruments that works? But I don't think I know an answer. Maybe other people do.
Well, Ivy, can I just follow up a little bit? I guess maybe I probably didn't phrase it very well, but I was thinking mostly specifically about like when you go out and pull your data off of your monitoring sondes, for instance, right? And you do your QA/QC and post your data on your website, like that's pretty much where it lives, right? And then other people use it, but like your website is like the home for that data. Does that make sense?
Yes, so I think that's part of what we had Parker Gassett at the last meeting. I mean, I think
Right.
ultimately the goal of this whole network was, can we get our data to the point where it could feed into the state-based information exchange that they're just starting to build out?
Yeah.
So,
okay.
So yes, I think ultimately it will get there, but nobody felt it was ready on either end, from the exchange end or from our end, in terms of getting a data product to them that's ready for that exchange.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's what I was after. Thank you.
This really does speak to what was mentioned earlier about the need for, this falls in that domain of technical support, I think. which is like it would be really helpful to have a community of practice set up the technical support meeting, convening meetings with these communities to understand their problems and to provide technical advice and recommendations. How should you go about QA/QCing the data? What are the requirements to know to determine what your data quality is? Where can you port your data? Because there are national archives that you could, if we do the quality of it, this is just a link to, there's a coastal synthesis product that's now been developed that we're looking to update on a regular basis. It actually synthesizes and pulls in a lot of coastal OA data. But all that's many, many steps away. But I mean, a lot of this speaks to that there's a real need in the community for a monitoring priority is this technical support aspect, which is interesting because there's literally directed congressional language to our office this year about increasing what we're doing along the lines of regional technical support. And we were like, what does that mean? I'm beginning to see what it might mean, right? So I think this is a real important aspect. We're getting to like what Sam was recommending for if you're going to be doing proxy algorithm developments, there's a whole community of practice around that could be engaged, and people could be trained on it and how you could work with your data to get the proper, because standing up an observing system might, if it's done in the context of trying to lean on machine learning and AI and other proxy data, could be more cost effective for everybody if it's done, if everybody's trained and knows how to do that, or has access to people that do it.
Yeah, so Dwight, it's interesting that you say that you're getting sort of not pressured, but I guess you're getting more emphasis on doing that from the federal level. And then on the other end, there's this project that I'm involved in. It's kind of from the other side, from the ground up, where groups in Maine came together and said, well, we need help doing this stuff. And then they went out and found funding through a nonprofit to support that for a couple of years. So we're kind of coming at it from both directions, from sort of top down, bottom up approach.
Yeah, we're definitely hearing it, and we're trying to understand what that means. And I think the conversation like this is really helpful. And I used to think of it as apart from our monitoring priorities, but now I'm thinking it's actually part of it.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
It's an important aspect of it.
Yeah,
that we need to include.
Chris, just to answer your question,
Thank
the
you.
Long Island Sound Study has a big push to get all of our data into WQX. Currently, due to our IT structure, our data cannot be housed on our Connecticut Deep website. So it is housed on the Lysicos and UConn ERDAP site. So it's available that way. We are making a big push right now to get all of our data up into WQX, and then it'll be available through the Water Quality Exchange portal. And the Long Island Sound Study also has a project in conjunction with USGS and John Morrison's group and the New York group, Chris Schubert's. And we're developing a Long Island Sound data mapper. And it will be kind of a web-based ArcGIS story map type product. And it will provide links to stations and then links to access the data. It won't actually house the data.
Katie, can you, I don't really know what WQX is. Could you just give me a one sentence explanation of where it is?
Where it is? Well, it's on an EPA. It's an EPA website.
It's EPA.
Like Data Quality Exchange. It was the precursor to store it, or the predecessor. I'm sorry, to store it.
Great, thank you.
I'll just mention that when we wrote our data repository report, when we checked in with WQX, there were some concerns about them able to take the time series continuous monitoring data. And so that's why we look to NOAA and Quasi's data repositories. But we really hope that WQX will be able to take this data, and things have maybe even changed.
So NOAA could take this data through. We have a specifically an ocean acidification data project that pulls in data that's both time series and discretely gathered, exactly this type of data. But I think we'd have to, again, get a better understanding of the uncertainties and accuracy of it. So the step one to that is, again, of that technical support aspect where we need to really quantify the uncertainties. And it isn't a question of whether it's not useful at its current accuracy level. It's just a question of knowing what that uncertainty is.
Yep.
Right? As long as it's well documented, it's useful.
So we're coming to the end of our allotted time here. I just wanted to encourage anybody, if they had a question, to use the raise hand function for our last couple of minutes. There is one in the chat that we got a little earlier from Mary Donato that says, question for Ivy or anyone. Do you have any suggestions on where smaller groups can look for funding to get started collecting similar data in their local embayments?
I don't. I mean, if this was one of the things, I don't know if there's NOAA funding for this purpose together with technical support. I work for a nonprofit, and I'm lucky enough to have, we work with a grant system and raising money for our monitoring. That's why we have the budget we have. So I'm going to leave this up to EPA and NOAA and others who are more aware of the funding sources.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific funding sources. I know that the NEPs do work with some smaller groups to collect the data that they're looking to gather to accomplish their goals. But I don't know of any specific coastal acidification funding for monitoring from the headquarters level.
I almost wonder if maybe that's something that could be part of the technical assistance, like helping to identify potential funding sources. Our NEP has been very generous to us, which is why you have a robust data source for Casco Bay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that suggestion. I would just say that I would just add that some states are providing support for through their OA action plans. And I know that Massachusetts has some, and New Jersey is developing an OA action plan. New York has some. I don't know if I see Mel just took his, brought his video on. I don't know if he had something to add there, but there may be some state resources for these sorts of things as well. And we have a list of those on the NECAN website, but we could also augment it with others that people come up with as a resource as part of the report we do.
Yeah, I was just going to add that it sort of depends on where you are. As I mentioned earlier, the Long Island Sound study has seen significant increases in its funding levels over the past 4 to 5 years. And we have a number of sub-grant kind of programs like the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. I know that Katie mentioned the Unified Waters project that the organization Save the Sound administers, and they provide support to smaller citizen and citizen science monitoring groups around Long Island Sound. So those are 2 avenues there, but that's Connecticut and New York. Our Southeast New England program, which covers the geography roughly from South Cape Cod down through Narragansett Bay, also gets more annual funding than any of our other national estuary programs. And then as you go north of Cape Cod, as Ivy mentioned, we've got Mass Bay's Estuary Partnership, our Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership in Casco Bay. All of those have seen some minor funding increases through the infrastructure law and their base funding, but they're still not as well resourced as these larger quote unquote geographic programs like Southeast New England and Long Island Sound. So if you're south of the Cape, there I think are more avenues and more potential sources from these geographic programs, but North of the Sound, I think the NEPs are a good place to start with. The Estuarine Research Reserves are another good partner there. They have a lot of familiarity with the types of maybe smaller funding sources that might be out there. So depending on where you are, I'd be happy to follow up with you if you want to do that offline.
I would
so
say
much.
from the NOAA side, a good place to look would be the Sea Grant Extension offices as well. They oftentimes provide pools of resources at these local levels. These are largely state waters we're talking about. So we have, our program has been careful to balance its investments to ensure that we're getting the federal waters covered, which is pretty big real estate, and really trying to help and coordinate state and local investment at the smaller and state waters themselves. But there is some federal resources that can be marshaled.
Okay, well, we're at 2:33 now. So unless anybody has any final question they might want to ask. No? Okay. I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Ivy. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Katie.